I landed at 2:30 in the morning, still smelling like jet fuel and sand, still wearing my dress blues because I didn't want to change until I stepped inside my own house. I hadn't seen that place in 14 months. I'd pictured it 100 times while we were out in the Gulf, how the porch light would glow, how the paint I'd rolled on myself would look under the street lamp. There was no porch light. There was no porch. Where my house used to sit in Oak Hollow Ridge, there was a flat stretch of dirt and a neat little square garden with rosemary and thyme planted in tidy rows, like something out of a home magazine. A wooden sign stuck in the soil read Future Community Green Space. I remember blinking hard, thinking I was still half asleep, maybe on the wrong street. But the mailbox still had my name on it. Caleb Mercer. Same curb. Same cracked bit of sidewalk I'd tripped on the day I moved in. Just no house. And then I heard the soft clap of slippers on pavement. Caleb, she said, like we'd run into each other at a grocery store. You're back earlier than expected. That was Lillian Cross, president of the Oak Hollow Homeowners Association. Silk robe, manicured nails, little white dog tucked under her arm like an accessory. I stared at the dirt where my living room used to be. Where's my house? She tilted her head, slow and sympathetic, the way people do when they're about to explain something awful but want to seem reasonable. You forfeited the property, sweetheart. Unpaid dues. Repeated violations. The board voted. It was all perfectly legal. Perfectly legal. My house, the one I bought for $420,000, sold at auction for $912. Demolished before I even touched down stateside. I let the silence stretch between us. I could feel my pulse in my ears, but my voice came out steady. You ever hear of the Service Members Civil Relief Act? Her smile flickered, just a hair. It doesn't apply to private community governance, she said quickly. Military service doesn't excuse financial responsibility. That was the moment I knew this wasn't some clerical mistake. This was deliberate. Let me back up a little. My name's Caleb Mercer. I'm 36, Navy electronics tech. The guy who makes sure the systems work when everyone else needs them to work right now. I bought that house 3 years before deployment. It wasn't fancy, just a 3-bedroom ranch with gray siding and blue shutters I painted myself. The yard was small, but it was mine. I didn't come from money. My dad drove a delivery truck. My mom worked double shifts at a diner. Owning a home felt like proof I'd done something right. Before deploying, I did what every paranoid sailor does. I prepared. I set up auto-pay on everything. I gave my buddy Nate full power of attorney. I printed copies of every payment confirmation and stuck them in a binder so thick it could stop a small bullet. And yes, I read up on the Service Members Civil Relief Act until I could quote sections from memory. That law exists for a reason. When you're deployed, you can't exactly show up at a court hearing or argue with an HOA about grass height. The act requires a court order before anyone can foreclose on or seize a service member's property while they're on active duty. No shortcuts. Lillian Cross moved into Oak Hollow about 6 months before I left. She bought the biggest house on the corner, circular driveway, 2-story columns, the whole thing. She'd been a real estate broker before her divorce, and she carried herself like she was still selling something every time she walked down the street. Within 3 months, she was on the HOA board. Within 6, she was president. At first, it was small stuff. Warning letters about trash cans being visible too long. Notices about acceptable holiday decorations. Then it started getting targeted. Sergeant Luis Alvarez got fined because his wife changed their oil in the driveway while he was deployed to Poland. Automotive commercial activity, Lillian called it. They paid nearly $3,000 to make it go away. Lieutenant Harper Dunn's elderly mother got hit with lawn violations while Harper was overseas. Another settlement. Quiet. Quick. I watched it happen. I didn't like it, but I told myself maybe there were details I didn't see. 6 weeks before I deployed, Lillian walked into my garage while I was organizing tools. Didn't knock. Just appeared in heels that clicked like a metronome. Caleb, she said, glancing at the small Navy flag in my front window. Military insignia must comply with aesthetic guidelines. It's 8 by 12 inches, I said. It's not a billboard. It's disruptive, she replied. We maintain visual harmony. Visual harmony. I remember thinking then that she wasn't just picky. She had something against the uniform. Maybe it was resentment. Maybe it was property values. Maybe it was control. Before I shipped out, I sent her certified mail. Included my deployment orders. Quoted federal law. Gave her Nate's contact info. I made it impossible for her to claim ignorance. 3 months into deployment, Nate called me. There's an issue, he said carefully. The bank switched processing systems. Your autopay hiccuped 1 month. She's claiming you're delinquent. Fix it, I said. I tried. She won't recognize my authority. Says military power of attorney doesn't apply to HOA matters. That's when the fees started stacking. $50 a day for abandoned property monitoring. $25 for administrative processing. $15 for certified mail. I emailed her from a ship in the Mediterranean, explaining federal law. She responded with one line. Military service is a personal choice and does not supersede community standards. 2 weeks before I came home, they declared the house abandoned. Scheduled an emergency auction. Sold it to a landscaping contractor named Victor Hale for $912. The bulldozers came before my plane landed. Standing there in the dark, staring at that herb garden, I realized something. Lillian thought I was the same as the others. Overseas. Busy. Powerless. She had no idea I'd spent 14 months reading regulations in my downtime. She had no idea how stubborn I am. And she definitely had no idea what she'd just triggered. The first thing I did after that conversation with Lillian wasn't yell, and it wasn't call the cops. I went to a 24-hour diner off Highway 9, still in uniform, ordered black coffee and a stack of pancakes I barely touched, and started making calls. When you've been in the military long enough, you learn something simple: emotion is fine, but documentation wins wars. The first person I called was an attorney named Rebecca Sloan. A friend of a friend had mentioned her once as the kind of lawyer who didn't scare easy. Her office was above a hardware store downtown, smelled like old paper and lemon polish, and she had this calm way of looking at you like she was already 5 steps ahead. I laid everything out: the missed autopay, the escalating fines, the auction price, the demolition. She didn't interrupt, just listened. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, Caleb, if what you're telling me is accurate, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is a federal violation. I slid my binder across her desk. It's accurate. She flipped through pages, nodded slowly. The Service Members Civil Relief Act requires a court order before foreclosure or forced sale during active duty. Do you see a court order here? No. Good, she said quietly. Because neither do I. That's when the shift happened in my chest. Up until then, I'd felt like a guy who got robbed. Now I felt like someone who might actually get justice. But Lillian wasn't stupid. Arrogant, yes. Careless, eventually. But not stupid. Rebecca filed an emergency motion in federal court within 48 hours. We requested an injunction, demanded financial records from the HOA, and notified the Regional Navy Legal Office. When you poke something like this, you don't do it halfway. Lillian's response came fast. Her attorney, some slick guy named Bradley Kent with hair that looked like it never moved in the wind, filed a motion to dismiss. His argument boiled down to this: the HOA had authority, dues were unpaid, procedures were followed, and military service does not grant immunity from private contracts. Rebecca read it, snorted softly, and said, he's hoping the judge doesn't feel like digging. But here's the thing about digging. I'm an electronics tech. I troubleshoot systems for a living. When something fails, I don't just replace a part. I trace the signal back to the source. So I started tracing. Nate came over to my temporary rental one night with takeout and a laptop. We spread HOA documents across the kitchen table. Public records are a beautiful thing if you know how to read them. 3 other emergency auctions in the last 4 years, all involving deployed military homeowners. All sold for less than $1,000. All purchased by companies connected to Victor Hale, that landscaping contractor who bought my house. Look at this, Nate said, pointing at a filing. Hale Outdoor Services, LLC. We followed that. It was owned by Blue Crest Property Holdings. Followed that. Owned by Evergreen Asset Group. And Evergreen was registered to a trust managed by Lillian Cross. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the screen. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was manufacturing violations, forcing auctions, then buying the properties through shell companies. Jesus, Nate muttered. The motive clicked into place when Rebecca pulled aerial maps of Oak Hollow Ridge. My house had been the only single-story structure blocking the lake view from Lillian's mansion and 2 other high-end properties. With my house gone, her property value jumped significantly. Real estate math is ruthless. She didn't hate military families. She saw opportunity. Military homeowners were perfect targets. Deployed. distracted, less likely to fight quickly. When Rebecca filed supplemental claims including conspiracy and fraud, things escalated fast. 2 days later, I got a call from Commander Elise Monroe at Navy Legal. "Petty Officer Mercer, we've reviewed your case," she said, voice crisp and controlled. "If the HOA proceeded without federal court approval during active duty, that is a direct violation of federal law. We are opening a formal review." I remember walking outside after that call, just standing in the sunlight. For the first time since landing, I felt steady. Lillian felt it too. Because that same week, the smear campaign started. Neighbors who hadn't returned my texts suddenly avoided eye contact. Mrs. Carlton from 2 houses down finally knocked on my door, wringing her hands. "Caleb, I just thought you should know," she whispered. "Lillian's been telling people you came back, unstable. That combat deployments can make men unpredictable. Unstable. That word hit harder than losing the house. You can take property. You can take money. But when someone tries to take your credibility, that's personal." 2 days later, I got a call from the county sheriff's office. They'd received a harassment complaint. Allegedly, I'd been photographing Lillian's property and making threats. I went down voluntarily. The deputy, a middle-aged guy with tired eyes, sat across from me in a small interview room that smelled like disinfectant and stale coffee. "Mr. Mercer, she's requesting a restraining order." I handed him my phone. Every photo I'd taken was of the vacant lot where my house had been. Time-stamped. No images of her. No threats. "Deputy," I said evenly, "I just returned from active duty. My house was auctioned without federal approval. I'm documenting evidence." He studied me for a moment, then left the room. When he came back, his tone had shifted. "Sir," he said, almost apologetic, "we've confirmed your deployment and the pending federal filing. We'll note that. The restraining order hearing was scheduled anyway." Lillian swore in her affidavit that I'd confronted her at 3 in the morning and implied I knew how to make problems disappear. Rebecca almost laughed when she read it. "She's overplaying," she said. "Narcissists do that." At the hearing, the judge asked Lillian a simple question. "Mrs. Cross, why were you walking your dog at 3 in the morning near a property under demolition?" She hesitated. "I couldn't sleep. I wanted to check on community improvements." Rebecca presented security footage from a neighbor's camera. It showed Lillian approaching me, smiling, gesturing toward the garden, no sign of threats. The judge denied the restraining order and referred the matter for review of false reporting. That's when the temperature really changed. Because federal agencies don't move quickly for nothing. They move when patterns appear. Within a week, I got another call. This time from an agent with the regional office of the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "we are coordinating with the Department of Justice regarding potential systemic targeting of active duty service members." Systemic targeting. That phrase carries weight. They'd identified at least 6 similar cases across neighboring counties. Same structure. Same shell companies. Same HOA procedural shortcuts. The numbers started adding up. Over $2 million in property value shifted through entities connected to Lillian. When I drove by my old lot one afternoon, I noticed something odd. The irrigation system for that little herb garden looked industrial grade. Thick PVC piping. High-pressure heads. I called the city utilities office on a hunch. "Commercial irrigation requires permits," the clerk said. "Environmental impact review too, if drainage is altered." No permits were on file. Which meant on top of federal violations, there were municipal code breaches stacking quietly in the background. Lillian had gotten greedy. And greedy people rush. The HOA announced an emergency board meeting for the following Tuesday, supposedly to address community misinformation. Rumor had it they were planning another auction, this time targeting an elderly widow whose son was deployed in South Korea. That was the moment this stopped being about my house. It became about a pattern. And if Lillian thought she could silence me with paperwork and gossip, she was about to learn what happens when someone she underestimated refuses to fold. The stage was being set, not just for a legal battle, but for something far more public. By the time Tuesday rolled around, Oak Hollow Ridge didn't look like a quiet suburban neighborhood anymore. It looked like something between a town hall and a federal sting operation. News vans lined the street. A few veterans from the local VFW showed up in caps and press jackets. Neighbors who'd spent years keeping their heads down were suddenly standing in clusters, whispering like they'd just realized they weren't alone. Inside the community center, The folding chairs were packed tight. I took a seat near the aisle, not in uniform this time, just jeans and a button-down. I didn't want this to be about optics. I wanted it to be about facts. Lillian walked in 10 minutes late. She was dressed in navy blue, pearls, hair perfect, posture straight. If you didn't know better, you'd think she was hosting a charity luncheon. She didn't look at me. She took her seat at the front table, tapped the microphone lightly, and smiled that polished smile. "We're here tonight," she began, "to address false allegations that have caused unnecessary panic in our community." False allegations. I could feel my jaw tighten, but I kept still. She went on about financial responsibility, about how no one is above the rules, about how certain individuals were trying to weaponize their military service for special treatment. That was her narrative, that we wanted exemptions, that we expected the world to bend. Then she made the mistake that cracked everything open. Military service, she said, voice steady, is a personal choice. And while we appreciate sacrifice, it does not entitle anyone to neglect their obligations to their neighbors. You could hear the air leave the room. It wasn't what she said exactly. It was how she said it. Clinical. Dismissive. A hand went up in the third row. It was Mrs. Donnelly, the widow whose son was deployed. "My boy's been overseas 8 months, she said, voice shaking. "You sent me a notice last week, threatening auction." Lillian didn't miss a beat. "The board follows established procedure regardless of personal circumstance." That was when Agent Carter stood up from the back row. She hadn't announced herself earlier. Plain suit. No badge flashing. Just calm authority. "Mrs. Cross," she said clearly, "I'm Special Agent Dana Carter with the Department of Justice. This meeting is being observed as part of an ongoing federal investigation into potential civil rights violations against active duty service members." The room shifted like someone had pulled gravity sideways. Lillian blinked once. "I don't see how that's relevant to a private homeowners association," she replied, but her voice had lost half a step. Agent Carter didn't raise her voice. "Relevant because foreclosing or seizing property from deployed service members without court approval violates federal law. Relevant because we have evidence suggesting a pattern." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Lillian glanced at her attorney, who looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Then she did something I still think about sometimes. Instead of stepping back, instead of deferring, she leaned forward into the microphone. "We have always acted within our bylaws. If certain homeowners feel targeted, perhaps they should examine their own compliance rather than blame community leadership." It was subtle, but it was blame. I stood up then. Not dramatically, just stood. "My auto pay glitched once," I said. "One time, while I was on active duty. You escalated that into daily fines, refused my power of attorney, held an emergency auction without federal court approval, and sold my home through a company you indirectly controlled." The word controlled hung in the air. Her attorney shot up. "That's an unfounded accusation." Agent Carter didn't even look at him. "We have traced ownership structures," she said calmly. "Multiple LLCs connected to Mr. Hale ultimately tie back to a trust under Mrs. Cross's management." Gasps. Real ones. Lillian's face drained of color. "That's absurd," she snapped. "I manage investment properties. That's not illegal." "Not illegal," Agent Carter agreed. "Unless those properties were acquired through fraudulent manipulation of homeowners' dues during protected active duty status." Silence. The kind that presses against your ears. Mrs. Donnelly started crying softly. Someone in the back muttered, "I knew it." And then Lillian did what people do when control slips away. She lashed out. "You people act like I'm the villain," she said, voice rising. Property values were stagnating. The board had to make hard decisions. Transient homeowners who leave for months at a time destabilize communities. Transient homeowners. That word hit harder than unstable ever had. Sergeant Alvarez stood up from the side wall. "I did 2 tours," he said evenly. "You fined my wife $3,000 for changing oil in our driveway while I was in Poland." Lillian shook her head. "Rules are rules." Agent Carter closed her folder. "Mrs. Cross," she said, tone unchanged, "you are under investigation for conspiracy, wire fraud, mail fraud, and violation of federally protected rights under the Service Members Civil Relief Act." 2 federal marshals stepped forward. I don't remember standing. I don't remember breathing. I just remember the metallic click of handcuffs. Lillian looked at me then. Not angry. Not apologetic. Confused. Like she genuinely couldn't understand how this had spun out of her control. As they led her toward the door, she said one last thing. I improved this community. Maybe in her mind, she had. 6 months later, I stood on the same patch of land where my old house once stood. The federal court ordered full restitution. Title restored. Damages awarded. The demolition contract voided. I didn't rebuild the exact same house. I built something better. Not bigger in some flashy way, just sturdier. A workshop out back. A front porch deep enough for actual conversations. The HOA board was replaced. New bylaws. Mandatory legal review before any enforcement action involving active duty members. Lillian pled guilty to several charges as part of a deal. She didn't get decades in prison like some people online hoped. She got time, fines, and permanent bans from managing any property association again. Victor Hale cooperated. His landscaping business folded quietly. Oak Hollow Ridge feels different now. Lighter. People wave again. But here's the part that still sticks with me. Lillian wasn't some cartoon villain twirling a mustache. She believed she was protecting investment value. She believed ends justified means. In her mind, military families were variables in a financial equation. That's the danger of power without accountability. It doesn't feel evil from the inside. I got my house back. I got compensation. I got vindication. But I also got a front row seat to how easily systems meant to maintain community can turn into tools for control. So here's what I want to know. If you were in that room, hearing her call deployed service members' transient problems, would you have stood up sooner? And if you live in an HOA now, do you really know what authority they have and what they don't? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you stand on this. Because the line between community standards and abuse of power is thinner than most of us think. And sometimes it only takes one person refusing to fold to expose it.